Good afternoon, students. I'm making this video for any kids that perhaps are going to miss my lesson in person or perhaps on Zoom. This is a slideshow that goes through the information that you need for lesson 29. This is about land tactics for World War One. So this is the assignment that I've pushed out on Google Classroom. You have a few questions you're trying to answer here, and then I'm going to be going through some specific tactics and strategies developed during World War One, where I'm going to want you to be able to describe the tactic here, and then also talk about the weaknesses of the tactic. Okay. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Again, this video is really for anybody that's absent. I think it's difficult to understand this slideshow just reading through and looking at it on your own. So I want you to hear what I have to say about it. All right, so I'm going to put this in full presentation mode. I will try to make this video about 15 minutes long, okay? So you can see the title here, Offensive Strategies to Deal with the Stalemate. When I'm teaching about war strategies, I try to make some correlations with sports, okay? So I want you to think about what you know about sports and playing defensively versus offensively. So if you're on the field and you're trying to play defensively, you're trying to hold your position. But if you're trying to play offensively, that means you're trying to take territory, you're trying to gain ground. So that's what this lesson is about. What did different generals and different sides do in the war to try to actually take territory and achieve ground in terms of winning the war? Here is a map that shows you where the war was fought in Europe after it broke out. Our last lesson was all about those causes of war. So you can see that Germany is not going to be successful in its initial plan to prevent a two-front war. I'm going to go back to German strategy in just a moment, but you can see here there's a Western front of fighting and there's an Eastern front of fighting with Russia. The Eastern Front will cease to exist more or less around 1917 when Russia drops out of the war because of its own communist revolution. The Western Front is what gets a lot of attention in history. Really, World War One is fought all over the world. It's fought in West Africa, it's fought in North Africa, it's fought in the Middle East, it's fought in the Pacific. But this gets a lot of attention because that's where the majority of men died. Okay. And you can see the furthest extent of the German advance here in this yellow line. So you can see they got pretty close to Paris. That was their initial objective, to try to seize the capital city in order to defeat France and then turn their energy against Russia. So I want you to understand what the term stalemate means. A stalemate, we use that term a lot if we're like playing chess, okay, for example. If you're playing a game of chess and it's a stalemate, then that means that neither side is winning and neither side can really move forward and advance. So World War One is characterized as a stalemate. The front line on the Western Front really doesn't move more than a couple miles in either direction throughout the duration of the war. When we get to World War II, I will talk about how that is not the case. World War II is a highly mobile war. The front line is always moving and changing. That is not the case, not the case in World War I, and that's why it becomes a trench war. Okay, so the Schlieffen Plan, you'll see a question about this in your assignment. This is the initial German attack that begins World War I and gets all of the powers really more or less involved. So I've talked to you guys about Germany's fears in terms of the military. They are worried about a two-front war in terms of like military strategy. That's something that you're trying to avoid. So Germany understands that Russia is far away and it's going to take Russia time to mobilize and get to the Eastern Front. So they think in their minds that they can really quickly just go into France and defeat France in 6 weeks. Like I said before, this is a little bit ambitious and perhaps a little bit egotistical. But this was what Germany did. You can see these different kind of like flanks or lines. These would be columns of men that would be attacking. France, when Germany declared war, expected Germany to attack here through its own border. But what Germany does is it invades neutral Belgium, which again is seen as very aggressive. It's the reason that Britain declares war on Germany. They see that as a very, very aggressive move. So this is a pretty surprising move to both Britain and France that Germany is invading through neutral Belgium. And their goal here is to basically kind of loop around. You can see that this flank has the toughest job to loop all the way around Paris, to seize the capital city, and then they would be able to win the war. Okay, this doesn't happen. This doesn't happen. I've already showed you that there's going to be two fronts of the fighting, and that's because some specific problems develop. Okay, so here are some of the reasons why the Schlieffen Plan fails. Okay, first of all, Russian railways had been developed further than the Germans thought. Their organization improved, so the Germans thought that it was going to take Russia 8 weeks to get to their border, and they're 2 weeks early. The German railways also only go so far into enemy territory. So as the Germans get further and further into enemy territory, they start to have issues with resupplying their troops. And then the Schlieffen Plan really didn't anticipate the level of resistance that they met in Belgium from both Belgian forces that tried to prevent their advance, and then also British forces assisting Belgium quite quickly. They also didn't take into account that France has airplanes, and they are cruising the skies, doing some reconnaissance, making sure that they know what Germany is doing in terms of movements. Another problem is that Germany really underestimated the impact of modern weaponry. When you're facing an enemy that can fire 500 rounds a minute with their weapon, it's maybe not going to be as easy to advance as you initially think. Okay. All right. Oh, why can't I move forward? Sorry. Okay, so a little bit more data just on this whole idea of the failure of the Schlieffen Plan. So the British Expeditionary Force had 150,000 men that they sent into Belgium really, really quick to delay and halt the German advance at a very famous battle called the Battle of the Mons. And by the end of August, German troops were 135 kilometers away from the nearest railway. So again, this starts to create issues with resupplying their troops. General von Kluck, which is a very, very famous general in the German military for World War One, he's struggling on that far right wing that I pointed out on the map to keep up with the 30 to 40 kilometer march per day. Okay, that's a lot. That's a lot. So his troops are actually struggling to keep up with the timeline that they've set forth. So finally, the German advance is halted in September. The actual war starts in July 28th. So there's kind of a lot of movement, I guess you could say, in August, but they are halted in September along the Marne River. And it's at this point where both sides will kind of dig down into a series of trenches. And this is followed by a race to the sea, a series of outflanking maneuvers where they're trying to get around the enemy. Remember that there's not a lot of planes in World War One. So look at this map with me for a second. If this is the front line, okay, and you are facing your enemy, the idea of you should be able to see my cursor here. Okay. The idea is that I'm going to try to loop around and get behind my enemy and encircle them. Well, both sides are doing that. They're trying to get around and get behind, outflank, 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 and then they end up doing that to the point where they reach the sea and they reach the mountains of Switzerland, the Swiss Alps. So they can't go any further in this attempt to outflank. And so they dig down in these series of trenches that really stretch from the North Sea all the way to the Swiss Alps. And again, here you're seeing how far the front line moved in either direction, which really wasn't that far. Okay. So after both sides kind of get dug down into these trenches, what happens is that both sides of the war, the Allies and the Central Powers start developing all of these new weapons and these new tactics to try to break the stalemate, to break through the enemy lines again and try to gain territory. The space between enemy trenches is known in history as like no man's land. So this was a very, very dangerous area. It was really, really muddy. Everything was just kind of blown away. There's no trees, no cover. There's landmines. It was a very actually scary war to fight in. I've said this before, perhaps in class. You know, if I had to be a soldier and fight in World War One or World War Two, I would have rather have been World War Two, because World War One in these trenches was actually so terrible. So here's another real life footage, a real life photo of men in the trenches. So living and sleeping in these trenches was absolutely horrific. One thing that they say that movies cannot replicate is the sound of warfare. It is so loud, and so deafening, and the bombs really just never stopped, for about 4 years, so it was pretty brutal. In these trenches, a lot of the men were, like, constantly wet. They got trench foot, and their skin started kind of rotting off their feet. There was all sorts of issues with, like, lice and rats, and they couldn't bury the bodies fast enough. You'll see some of that in the video that I left for you. Okay, so let's get to these offensive strategies. I'm gonna try to go fast because I know that you guys don't wanna watch a really long video. Okay, so the first tactic is preliminary artillery bombardment, okay? And that is pretty much what it says, okay? You're going to bombard using shells or artillery the enemy trenches really, really heavily, okay? So they would get their cannons in position and they would just bomb as many as they could throw to the enemy trenches, and then they would send in a wave of infantry. Now, the purpose of that tactic is to try to take out the machine gunners that are waiting in the trenches. The problem is these shells were not very accurate in World War One. A lot of them didn't go off. The enemy trenches, particularly Germany's trenches, were actually the best trenches, and they were strongly reinforced with concrete. So they would shell, send in troops, and people would just basically climb out of their trenches, get behind their machine guns, and mow people down. Also, the barbed wire that was in front of the trenches was not cut by the shells. And once you start preliminary artillery bombardment and you start shelling the enemy in some massive barrage, basically you're letting them know that you're coming, and you're giving them some warning that something's about to occur. Okay. So preliminary artillery bombardment is improved upon with the creeping barrage. What this is it's synchronized bombing while infantry troops are advancing. So that's what this graphic is trying to show you. Obviously, you can anticipate that maybe there's some problems with this. It does need to be timed just right. Okay. So the purpose of this tactic is to try to provide cover for your men that are advancing, right? If the men in these trenches behind here are getting bombed with shells, they're going to be less apt to shoot and kill all of these men that are trying to head across the field. The problem is it's World War One. It's 1914. Synchronization was very, very difficult because once your troops would leave the trench and start their advance, there was no way to call them back. There was no way to communicate with them. It's not like, when people fight today, they have like little earpieces and stuff and you can communicate. So the troops could advance too rapidly and not receive cover like is intended through the shelling. Or sometimes there would be instances of friendly fire where they were advancing too slowly and they would get hit by their own shells. Okay, so another tactic that I want to talk about is the development of mines and just laying mines. These were usually tunneled into the ground. We also use sea mines. I want you to think about the movie Finding Nemo. I bring that up a lot in class because there's a scene there where you see some mines under the ocean. And that's what you want to think of. If a ship touches that, it's going to explode. But there were tons of landmines in no man's land in between the series of trenches that were facing one another. So the purpose was to lay them under enemy trenches. The goal for all of these tactics, guys, is to try to breach the line. Okay. The problem with mines is that digging tunnels was really hazardous. And of course, you could step on your own mine if you're not keeping track of where they're all being placed. And sometimes there was just detonation inaccuracies where they would go off by the people who were trying to place them. Of course, this is one of the most characteristic developments of World War One, the development of the tank, first used by the British in 1916 in the Battle of the Somme. The first tank that you see in World War One is like terrible for a lot of different reasons. It's super slow. This goes about 4 miles per hour. We can walk faster than that just to kind of give you a sense of how slow that is. It would get stuck terribly in the mud here. So sometimes you have to get troops to kind of like come kind of get it out of the mud. Obviously, the purpose of the tank is to provide cover for men so they're not just gunned down. So this is providing some cover. You can also see that there's some guns that are mounted to the tank. But if you read any literature on early tanks, then you learn that it was like terrible to be inside them. They could only hold a couple men, and the gases or the fumes inside the tanks were almost suffocating for the men that were inside them. Of course, tanks are going to be major in World War II. One of the reasons that the war is so mobile as well, and they're going to be improved upon massively by Hitler and Stalin, really all sides. Okay. So again, the tank is a really big technological development of World War One. Here are some weaknesses. Again, it moved really slowly. If you're moving 4 miles an hour across across no man's land, you're giving the enemy a lot of time to think about what they're going to do to take that tank out. Okay, in terms of maybe trying to shell it or whatnot. And then, of course, it also got stuck a lot. Just got stuck in the mud. All right, we're almost there. This is one of the last developments I want to talk to you about for land tactics, and that's the use of chemical warfare. So you're seeing that here. These are early gas masks that are developed to try to respond to this threat. Gas was first actually used by the Germans in 1915, but like all of these weapons, they will be quickly adopted by both sides. There's three different types of gases that are used in World War One: tear, chlorine, and mustard gas. Tear gas and chlorine gas, like they figure out how to respond to that pretty quick because chlorine gas is water soluble. So you could put like wet rags in your mask and you could neutralize the gas. It's mustard gas that was really terrible and dangerous. Mustard gas, if you breathe it in, it like eats away all your mucous membranes. It would attack every part of the body that was moist, your throat, like your armpits, your genitals, places like that, would just start to get eaten away. And it was a really terrible way to die. Um, Chemical warfare was probably one of the most scary inventions for troops that fought in World War One because they were blinded. If you could imagine being in a war and being blinded, that's absolutely terrifying for the men who had to witness that and go through that. Uh, the weaknesses with trying to use gas is that the wind can blow it the other way, and so this actually happened a lot where they would try to shell canisters of gas at the enemy trenches, and then it would just kind of blow back in their face. Of course, they also have masks developed to protect soldiers from this new invention. Though early on they're not very effective, and early on there's not enough of them. Okay. Chemical warfare will actually be outlawed by the international community after World War One. All parties believe that this is not something that should be used in war. Okay, so how can we characterize the Western Front of World War One? World War One is trench warfare. Trench warfare. They are digging down in these trenches. This is a total war. All sides are giving all of their resources to war production. While men are away, women are stepping into factories. Products are being rationed on the home front to make sure that there's enough for the war. Um, it's a big deal for the nations that are fighting in it. We would also characterize, especially the Western Front, as a war of attrition. Now, that's a new term that I haven't talked about yet. A war of attrition is a really bad deal. That means that strategy has broken down and there is no strategy anymore. So normally, again, in war, you try to seize terrain. You try to seize like specific objectives and hold those positions. Um, but if you're not able to do that and you don't really have a strategy for seizing specific things, how do you know who's winning? Well, that's what happens in Vietnam too. Basically, they weren't able to seize strategic locations very easily. They were fighting in the middle of the jungle. They start just counting bodies to determine who's winning. So that's the strategy of, if I kill enough people on the other side, maybe they will get too weak to continue the fight. Um, Again, when you see a war turn into a war of attrition where you're just counting bodies, that's generally bad. That's generally bad. Okay. Again, what the Western Front is also a stalemate. Okay. Stalemate. And a highly mechanized war. So the reason that so many people die in World War I is that the generals were not able to really respond to these tactics effectively. There's a specific general, General Haig of the British Army, that's like pretty much has a terrible reputation after the war. There are certain days in World War One where, if you can imagine, just within a few miles of the front line, 60,000 people die in one day because of machine guns, and they are just ordered out of their trenches to run when the generals know most of them are going to get mowed down and very few, if any, will break through the line. That's almost insane. Okay. And so people recognize that after the war. And of course, World War II, again, will not be fought that this way, largely because of the advent of airplanes. So for the rest of the lesson, you guys are going to be watching a video here. Shell shock. I want you to take 15 film facts. You should know how to do that. Thank you so much, guys, for paying attention. And that is it for this video.